Hi everyone. Recently I had commented on the Daytona 500 on my Google Plus account and given some kudos to Dale Earnhardt Jr. for the win. And Blue Is had left a comment on there saying, could you please explain what the draw is? What's the fascination with motorsports? I kind of feel like it's something you either get or you don't, but I'll do my best to sort of explain what the draw is for me, at least. I kind of divide it into four categories. There's the mechanical aspect of racing. There is the man and machine aspect. I would say man versus machine, but I think if that's the case, you're doing it wrong. There is the strategy aspect, and then there ultimately is the competition, the sort of mono-a-mono aspect of auto racing. And all of those put together make it very complex and comprehensive, both in terms of participating or even just as a spectator sport. So we'll start at the beginning, the mechanical aspects. Obviously, as many of you know, I'm an automotive mechanic by trade, so I'm quite interested in all the different technological aspects of the modern race car, and even the old race cars. Actually, in some ways, I prefer the older race cars of the 60s and 70s because there was a lot of imperfect technology involved, and so while they were wickedly fast, a lot of them, they were still on the infancy of tire technology and aerodynamics, so these cars were a handful to drive, and it took a really skilled driver to handle them. Although I can appreciate the high-tech aspects of the modern race car and all of the things that they do to get, extract every last horsepower out of an engine while maintaining the longevity that they require, the setup of the suspension to maximize the adhesion, on the track itself, and even getting down to shock absorber technology, and of course the modern aerodynamics of the race car. So I'm interested in all those aspects, just sort of from a gearhead standpoint. Then we move on to man and machine, and this to me is where the real art, the real poetry is in auto racing. It's that maximizing of the four contact patches that we have between the car and the road, the surface, and maximizing our ability to get through each corner utilizing as much of the road and the grip available in the car as we can. And depending on which track you're on, there's many different ovals and road courses around the world. I prefer road racing. There are times when there may be an ultimate way to go through a corner, to clip the apex just at the right point, the right part in the corner to apply the throttle. However, if you're in a series of corners, you may have to sacrifice the ideal line in one corner to set yourself up for the perfect exit off the final corner in a series to maximize your straightaway speed after that corner. That's sort of learning in any given road course where to give up a little bit of time to gain a lot of time elsewhere. And I have a racing simulator that I built at home, several of them actually, and I've spent many a time by myself, hour after hour, alone on the track without being involved in a sim racing league where there's other guys driving, just perfecting my racing line and watching that lap timer to see what corners I'm losing speed, what corners I'm gaining speed or time. And to me, there's a real poetry to that. And again, once you get in the groove where you feel like you're doing it right, it becomes a little bit of a ballet. There's just lots of fluid, smooth movements within the car, and you know you're onto something when your lap times get very, very consistent. You may be incrementally getting quicker, but there's a lot of consistency to your lap times. And I used to be involved in several simulated racing leagues where I would race with other guys, and I would spend 6 nights a week working on my setup and on my race strategy and just running laps so that I could enter the weekly race really feeling like I had it under my belt. And so that gets us to strategy a little bit. And strategy, this has to do with how much fuel do you take, when do you pit? Do you pit just to get enough fuel to go to the end, or do you take extra time in the pits to take on tires? And will the faster lap times that the new tires may facilitate sort of make up for the extra time in the pits? Sometimes in a race I would find that my car's balance was upset too much by taking a full tank of fuel. All that extra weight in the back would tend to upset the balance of the suspension that I had. And so I found it was actually advantageous to take a little less fuel at the start and maybe stop one extra time, but overall in the period of an hour and a half long race, that would actually be the net faster way. And of course, there will be things like caution periods. If there's a big accident on the course, you have to take that into consideration, because then you would have an opportunity under the reduced speeds of the caution period to pit or not to pit. And maybe instead of pitting, you stay out on the track, and that moves you forward in the running order. And there's many other things. Fuel economy was something that I worked on quite a bit when I was even in simulated racing. Fuel economy is an aspect, and I worked on that quite a bit as well. And then of course there's the mono-y-mono, the competition, the head-to-head running lap after lap. And there's a lot of interesting mind games that you can play, I guess we could say. I tended to be better either way out front. If I could get where my lap times were really quick and I could sort of jackrabbit away from everybody and get a big lead, I could build a very comfortable lead where I would run very, very consistent lap times. If someone was right on my tail, however, they could work on me mentally. You know, they're just there dogging you, waiting for you to make a mistake. And there were times when I would actually make a small mistake and recognize it and just actually let my car drift wide and let them pass me, and then I was very good behind another car. That's when I was at my best. If I was in competition with other racers, would be the guy putting the pressure on the leader and really working him over and sort of getting inside his head. And that I find very fun. When it comes to auto racing, again, I think it's one of those things you either get or you don't. I mentioned sort of the golden era of auto racing, the 60s and the 70s, some might argue the 50s. These cars were interesting because it was at the early dawn of understanding aerodynamics. And so they were making cars very sleek. They were starting to understand that, you know, these sleek cars were slippery in the air, but they didn't understand the interplay of aerodynamics and downforce. And that's something that's very critical. Of course, if you make a car very, very slippery through the air, it doesn't apply any downward pressure on the tires. And so, yes, the car goes faster, but now you have a limit of adhesion. You've only got those 4 contact patches with the racing surface, and you need some downward pressure. And this is why you see a lot of these race cars with big wings on them in one form or another. And Tabletop Joe 33 and Talladega Tom and I were commenting back and forth on my last video where they were making note of the old Porsche 917s here in the background. Here's one here. These were some of the examples of these unbelievable race cars of the 60s and 70s. And as you can see, there's definitely some work in aerodynamics in the design of this car. But as Vic Elford retold in forward to a book on the Porsche 917, these things were absolute animals. They were some of the first cars that they had that were capable of 360 to 400 kilometers an hour with the old tire technology of the time. And they made these cars fairly aerodynamic, but they didn't quite understand downforce just yet. And so as Vic Elford told it on the Mulsanne Straight at Le Mans in '69, they were testing the prototype. It was the pre-production or the pre-prototype version of this car. It pretty much took the full width of the track on the Mulsanne Straight just to keep the car in a relatively straight line. And this was more than a 2-lane road. It was actually 2 lanes plus very generous shoulders. So this was a wide track. And when they were singing down the Mulsanne Straight at 360 kilometers an hour, these cars were just all over the place. And the slower series cars, because they raced multi-tiered classes at Le Mans, so they had some cars that were fully 100 kilometers an hour slower than these cars. They learned when they saw one of these monsters coming in the rearview mirror to get right over to the right as far as they could to stay out of the way. And there was Vic retells some stories about mishaps in the dark of night with these cars at full song. They were 12-cylinder monsters, these things, and they just had no margin for error. So it's quite interesting to listen to those kind of stories, and that's where the man and machine part comes in. It's almost like you're trying to tame a beast. And for the right race car drivers, there are a few out there who mastered that in a way that most of us could only dream of. They just had a knack for it, whatever it was. The car fit them like a glove, and they could make things happen with that car that were almost magic. And I've mentioned a couple times that I have a racing simulator here at home. I did fairly well when I was racing in the sim racing leagues. We moved a couple of years ago and built a new shop, and my life's been quite busy since then, so I haven't had the opportunity to get involved in these racing leagues. Since that time that I was in the leagues, iRacing.com, which is the racing simulator service that I use, has progressed. They have many world-class road courses and ovals. They're all laser scanned down to within several square millimeters, so all the elevation changes in those tracks are present. The areas of the track that have limited grip are there, rumble strips and cracks in the pavement and that sort of thing. The cars are all modeled, and more importantly, the tires are modeled through heat cycles. So they've really done a good job with this racing simulator of going through and letting you experience what it's like when your tires get hot, when you've sort of gotten your tires mad, or when you've got a bad setup and the tires have paid the penalty for that, and you lose grip as time goes on. Similarly, as you burn off the fuel load and the balance of the car changes, the handling characteristics change, and it's a real joy. They've recently included several of the Porsches that are involved in the Porsche Cup Series, and I haven't had an opportunity to race them much, but I did run a couple of laps in a Porsche at one of my favorite tracks, which is Canadian Motorsports Park, or as I'll forever know it, Mosport, which is a wonderful road course here in Canada with lots of elevation changes on the corners. And for anybody who's familiar with road racing at all, this is a particular challenge. Again, it's just one of the many challenges of mastering that dance that is driving a race car, in that when you crest a hill that also has a corner to it, it unloads the suspension. So I mentioned earlier aerodynamics and downforce. Downforce is when we use the wind to push down on the car. The faster you go, the wind wedges the car down on the ground and puts more force on those contact patches. You can imagine, conversely, if you come up over a rise and you're trying to make a corner at the same time, it unloads the suspension and it takes that compression off of the tires and you lose grip. So this is just one of the things that makes racing at Canadian Motorsports Park such a challenge. So I thought I'd include a couple of laps in the new Porsche. These are my first laps in many months, and also my first laps in this car. So you'll have to be kind with me in the comments as to critiquing my driving style. Hopefully I've done a little bit to explain why I find motorsports interesting. Both, I've done very little in a real car. I've done quite a bit in racing simulators, and I enjoy it as a spectator sport. Thanks very much for watching, and let's run a couple laps.